Shalom, I'm Shani Tarragon, and welcome to the podcast Secrets of the Scroll, Hidden Messages of Megillat Esther by Matan Mizrahi, powered by the Walter Foundation. In this series, we're going to explore textual allusions, literary messages that are hidden in the text of Megillat Esther, teaching us messages of not only the story itself, but allusions to the other 23 Sfarim of Tanakh. Please join me on this remarkable journey of learning through Tanakh through the eyes of Megillat Esther. Albeit in our last class with Dr. Yael Ziegler, we began to discuss allusions in Megillat Esther to Sefer Melakhim. We're going to see today as we continue with stories further on in Sefer Melakhim, both Melakhim Aleph, Melakhim Bet, that were initially written as Chazal attribute to Yirmiyahu Hanavi as one canonized Sefer. We recognize that there are certain themes that repeat themselves not only in Sefer Melakhim, but basically they're revisited as allusions in Megillat Esther. And when we think of Sefer Melakhim as mentioned, not only clearly in Galut do we ask questions such as, who's the real king? Where's the real palace of the king? Alluding to the kingship of Hashem, alluding to the Beit HaMikdash. But we can't help but also appreciate through the phenomenal dynamic stories of kings and queens in Sefer Melakhim, how of course these are going to be ideas that are going to be revisited by Mordechai and Esther. And if until now we've suggested various links between Megillat Esther and the other 23 Sifrei Tanakh, predominantly the story of Yosef in Mitzrayim, and not only alluding to the promotion of Yosef to Viceroy, but even Eshet Potiphar and Yosef, or stories, as we'll see, of Megillat Esther and Sefer Daniel, more contemporary. But we also are going to pay attention to specific, not just broader themes, but specific stories. And here I'd like to give credit, as Chazal teach us, learned from Esther herself, Hamagid Davar B'Shem Omro, Mevi Geula La'olam, that someone who says something in the name of someone else, just as Esther brings the words of Mordechai regarding the proposed assassination planned by Bigtan and Teresh. And henceforth, not only was it written down, but that's what is going to prompt Achashverosh ultimately to think about how to reward Mordechai. And that's what's going to cause the role reversal between the promotion of Haman and his subsequent demotion. And henceforth, V'nahafochu, all because Esther made sure to mention Mordechai's participation in overhearing their plan. So too, I'd like to give credit, even though I've mentioned here and there, but to give specific credit to those that have explored these themes of allusions before, again, to appreciate these various messages. So, for example, Dr. Yitzchak Berger, who wrote about the associations of Mordechai and Esther to Shaul and Amalek, and basically the rise of the Benjaminite kingdom as a prelude to literally adopting both aspects of Malchut Binyamin together with Malchut Yehuda, Malchut Shaul together with Malchut David, in order to restore kingship to Yisrael. I'd also like to thank the commentaries that I read of Dr. Adele Berlin in her JPS commentary on Megillat Esther, and certainly Dr. Yonatan Grossman, a friend, a colleague, teacher, who points out the dynamic allusions, one of which we're really going to highlight right now as we discuss and continue to discuss the allusions to Sefer Melakhim in Megillat Esther. And also to thank a personal professor of mine from Bar Ilan University who also wrote a commentary on Megillat Esther for the Da'at Mikra series, Professor Rava Gabriel Chaim Cohen. So now let's take a look at an allusion that Professor Yonatan Grossman points out, particularly in Sefer Melakhim, no longer in the time period of just the Judean united monarchy of Shlomo HaMelech, but rather, as we know, after the division of the Malchut and after the very unstable governments following the initial establishment of Yeravam ben Nevat as king of Yisrael, we hear of notorious Achav, the son of Omri, who had moved the capital of the Shomron of the northern kingdom from the areas of Tirzah to Har Shomron in Emek Yisrael. And we hear about Achav, who marries Izebel, the Phoenician princess, and henceforth nationalizes idolatry. Perhaps then the most notorious king of Malchut Yisrael, for which, as we know, he's going to be severely punished through the merid, the rebellion of Yehu. But there's a remarkable story where we find that Eliyahu, as the Navi HaMelech, the core prophet of his time, is meant to deliver an explicit message to Achav following a horrific incident that Mordechai and Esther draw numerous allusions to, an incident of Kerem Navot, a case where Achav wants to expand his area, his garden literally, and as such wants to purchase lands of his next door neighbor, Navot. And Navot henceforth refuses, explaining, Chalila li mahashem mititi et nachalat avotai lach. After which, Achav comes back home extremely distraught, and Izebel, seeing this, tells him, don't worry, I'll take care of everything. What does she do? A horrific plan. She basically sends messengers to appoint, or really to nominate Navot to serve as a judge, and then she secretly plans false witnesses to testify against him as a nominated judge, to testify that he's cursed God and therefore he's deserving of being stoned to death. And that's exactly what happens. On completely false pretenses, Navot is going to be killed based on Izebel's plan. Izebel then tells Achav, who seems to be absent from this entire scene, and she tells Achav, now you can go inherit the field, to which Hashem sends Eliyahu to reprimand him with the famous words, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, it's not enough that you've killed someone and thereby hold Achav personally accountable for the murder of Navot, but also you're coming now in a brazen nature to inherit this field that doesn't belong to you. And ultimately, as we take a look then at Megillat Esther, we also find that there's been a terrible plan not just to annihilate one person, but to falsely and on completely unjust grounds annihilate an entire peoples, the Jewish people. So let's see how this is done and how Mordechai and Esther draw allusions to this horrific story in Sefer Melakhim, not only teaching us about the whims of kingship and certainly teaching us about those kings and queens that undermine what true justice is, but to be able to extrapolate even further messages. So let's begin by turning to Megillat Esther, where we see that Haman somehow is able to convince Achashverosh to annihilate an entire people, very similar to the way that Izebel, somehow in a very cunning manner, is able to convince different members of the community to falsely accuse Navot of his cursing of God. How is this all done? We open up Megillat Esther, and we hear that immediately after this plan of annihilation, letters were dispatched to all the Medinot HaMelech. All of the gzerot, the decrees, are going to be delivered through letter, through Patshegen Haktav. And that reminds us so much of this scene of annihilation in Sefer Melakhim with Izebel, who also just sits in her palace, and with the signet ring of the king, reminding us clearly of Achashverosh and his signet ring, just stamps and seals everything with the approval of Achav, who seemingly doesn't really know what's going on. So right away we see that Mordechai and Esther are writing about the story of Achashverosh's participation in the decree of annihilation against the Jews, as if Achashverosh is Achav, who seemingly doesn't really know what's going on, and Haman is vicious Izebel, who's dispatching all these letters to ensure that the genocide takes place. So, just like Izebel wrote these letters in Achav's name, Haman, as we know, writes these letters in Achashverosh's name. So not only do we see the idea of the negative judgment of the king, but ultimately, by drawing the solution, we're meant to realize that it really is Achashverosh, who seemingly is not really part of the story, but Mordechai and Esther are saying he's like Achav, who is going to be the one who is reprimanded. Achashverosh is acting in a very unjust manner, even if he is the passive king, which ultimately also is a mockery, just like Achav is portrayed as a very passive, almost childish-like type of king, while Izebel wears the pants, while Izebel runs the kingdom, so too, again, as if Haman is really the one running the kingdom and Achashverosh is the vassal, a real reversal of power. So even if Achashverosh can perhaps even claim innocence, what Mordechai and Esther are saying is that this is feigned innocence. Of course he's responsible. And that's exactly what we see in the story of Achav and Izebel. Achav is just as responsible, if not primarily responsible, knowing what's going on behind the scenes and accusing an innocent man of a wrongdoing that will ultimately cost him his life. In addition to this connection, holding Achashverosh just as responsible as Achav, as Eliyahu reprimands Achav, we find another comparison of the scenes with the same narrative, namely that when Haman, as we know, returns from Esther's first party, he encounters Mordechai, if you remember, who does not get up. He doesn't stir. Lo kam, lo yichra, lo yishtachaveh. He doesn't stir. He will not bow down to him. And therefore, Vayimalei Haman chema. Haman is filled with wrath against Mordechai for something seemingly so silly. And that's exactly the illusion that Mordechai and Esther are drawing to. Where else do we see a king, someone in a position of power, acting in such a juvenile manner? None other than the story of Achav and Navot. As soon as Navot tells him that he can't sell him his vineyard, he can't sell him his nachala, so that Achav can now expand his garden. Vayavo Achav el beito sar v'zaif al hadavar asher diber elav Navot Yisraeli vayomer lo etein lachat nachalat avotai. Vayishkav al mitato vayasev et panav v'lo achal lechem. How does Achav respond? He literally, like a child, comes in with his stormy temper and won't eat and won't drink and just puts his face in his pillow and goes to sleep. And that's when Izebel literally treats him like a child and responds and says, don't worry, and if he won't give his vineyard through selling it, ata tase melucha. You go act as king, but don't worry, I'll take care of everything. Where do we find almost the exact same narrative with this exact same, now I'm going to pose not just an analogy, but a dynamic analogy. We see that with Zeresh's response to Haman. If Mordechai and Esther drew Achashverosh initially as Achav, holding him responsible, even though it seems that he's very passive, similarly, now Haman, through his very childish behavior, is going to be viewed as Achav, and Izebel is going to be almost caricatured here through Zeresh. Zeresh is the one who really creates a plan, and basically, like Inception, she basically is going to falsely recommend to Haman to falsely accuse Mordechai of treason and thereby have him hanged on gallows, prepare the gallows, a ridiculous height, even higher, by the way, than the Beit HaMikdash, which stands 30 amot tall. This is going to be 50 amot tall. So once again, what Mordechai and Esther are trying to tell us is look at Zeresh. Look at this evil, Izebel-like character who is going to also suggest to very haughty, but seemingly now passive, very sensitive, almost ridiculously sensitive Haman, what to do in order to gain the power that he wants to gain, which we already know is unjust power. And this obviously is not just an allusion to Achav and Izebel, but really to the entire zeitgeist, entire spirit of the times, both in Sefer Melakhim, teaching us that such kingship cannot last. It cannot endure if it's not going to be built on the pillars of Mishpat that we saw from the beginning of Sefer Melakhim with Shlomo HaMelech. So too, deep down we know that if this is portrayed as an Izebel and Achav-like story, just as we speak about in Shoshanat Yaakov, that Arura Zeresh and Aror Haman, then of course this power, and one can even argue this partnership of crimes, again, cannot endure either. What's also remarkable is how both of these women, Zeresh and Izebel respectively, each plan a fictitious trial, or basically are going to falsely accuse this innocent victim by presenting their deaths as if this was all done in a legal way. And both Navot, he was nominated, and therefore witnesses are going to be called. And yes, there'll be false witnesses, but ultimately that's what will lead to his death. And similarly, Zeresh, who basically is going to say falsely accuse Mordechai of treason. And of course, there's going to be a fictitious trial, but ultimately prepare the gallows already because he is going to be put to death. And what's remarkable is that Mordechai and Esther are basically saying that this is all a guise. It looks as if what's going on in Persia right now is all very legal, is all very just, but that's exactly it. It's anything but. Turn back to the story of Achav and Izebel. And if we're not convinced that they want us to appreciate the analogies to the story of Kerem Navot, then there's one more. And that is that when Eliyahu comes to reprimand Achav, specifically in the vineyard of Navot, with those words of Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, that is basically the last straw. That's when Hashem says, tell Achav that such malchut cannot continue, and therefore he and his wife Izebel are going to suffer a horrific death. To which Achav responds, as soon as he hears this, with the following expression, Vayikra begadav, vayasem sak al besaro, vayatzom, vayishkav basak, vayahaloch at. He tears his clothing, he places sackcloth, he fasts, and he is going to walk slowly. We open up Megillat Esther, and we see that as soon as Mordechai hears about the terrible decree, not just against him, but literally against the entire Jewish population in 127 lands, he responds in the exact same way as Achav. He is also going to rent his garments. He is also going to, as Esther commands, basically to fast. He is also going to walk through the streets of Shushan screaming and crying. And what is the message there? Well, how does Hashem respond to Achav's expression of sorrow, of grief, of remorse? Hashem tells Eliyahu, if this is how he responds, then because he responded in such a submissive manner, lo avi hara'a biyamav bimei beno avi hara'a beto. Achav himself is going to be spared, and the punishment will only come the next generation. Perhaps Mordechai, again personified in an ironic manner as Achav, but remorseful Achav, repentant Achav, knows that if he acts this way, then maybe the Gzeirah of annihilation, maybe literally the decree of Kerem Navot, orchestrated by Achav and Izebel, orchestrated in his time by Haman and Achashverosh, maybe it can be overturned, which ultimately we know it is. What's ironic, though, and as soon as we hear all the resonances, we know that we're also supposed to not only hear the consonants, but the dissonance, is the difference in the stories is that in the case of Achav, Achav expresses remorse and basically distances himself from the queen. He's outside of the palace at the time. And then we don't see them together. As a matter of fact, Achav will go out to war, will be killed in war, and then we hear about the horrific death of Izebel, separated from the story of Achav. In the case of Mordechai, albeit outside of the palace, acts with remorse, outside of the palace, expresses the avelut, the mourning, just like Achav. But what does he do? He goes right back to his palace, because in his palace awaits not an Izebel, but an Esther. And that's really the redeeming factor that Mordechai and Esther want to say. That Mordechai goes to Izebel and he says, now's the time for you to act. Perhaps he really is thinking about the Achav and Izebel Kerem Navot story, where it was the queen who played the primary role. She was the mover and the shaker behind the scene, and therefore Mordechai goes to Esther and says, you can be that powerful queen. Mi yodea im la'ed kazot higat l'malchut. If Izebel undermined what true kingship of Yisrael is supposed to be like, if Izebel was that notorious character of queen who literally defied the true values of Judaism, then you, Esther, you have an opportunity not only to redeem the ancestry of Shaul, but to redeem queenship. You can redeem the queen acting on behalf of the Jewish people, not selfishly, but selflessly. You can be that queen who encourages her king, whom we've already seen is an Achav-like character. Well, if he's passive, then Esther, you can be the one to encourage him to do good. You can be the force, not of demise, but of salvation. So what's remarkable is that Mordechai and Esther allude to the story of Kerem Navot by playing off of the Achav character. That at first we see that Achashverosh is like Achav, this very passive king who allows other people to decree horrific, selfish decrees of annihilation for their own greed and for their own power. Then we see by the end that Haman is also an Achav-like character in a very angry, childish, certainly selfish manner as well. And lastly, we recognize how Mordechai and Esther also wove Achav into the Mordechai character, but in the most emboldened and in the most righteous way. And here we already see the purpose of these allusions, particularly in Sefer Melakhim, to teach us not only ideological messages, but theological messages of who has the right to be king. As we know from the beginning of Sefer Melakhim, and ultimately also from Sefer Shmuel, the barometer is going to be one who listens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's not just on a basic level of divine will. It's also about social justice. It's also about morality. That those who understand, as Shlomo HaMelech did, what Chochmat Lev is all about, what that terminology of Chochmat Lishpot, of judgment and justice in society, that was completely undermined by Achav and Izebel, and basically Mordechai and Esther come to tell you that that's the culture in which they find themselves, and they're going to attempt to restore proper kingship through justice, through remorse, through highlighting the selfishness and the injustice of the malchut around them. Which brings us now to the next story of Sefer Melakhim, or the next analogy, which is going to be another story of sending letters and another story of trying to repair kingship. And this is what we find in Melakhim Bet, in the story of the salvation of Yoash, which is also preluded through a notorious queen, through Atalia, a descendant of Achav and Izebel, of course, who ultimately has her entire family murdered for selfish, powerful reasons to assure that she is going to assume the throne. And Yoash, the one descendant, basically her grandson, who survives through his aunt Yehosheva, who takes him into hiding in the Beit HaMikdash with the Kohen Gadol, her husband, with Yehoyada, who stays there and basically protects Yoash for 7 years. And then at the time that Yoash becomes king, which goes hand in hand with the assassination of Atalia, we hear how Yehoyada is not only going to protect Yoash, but then establish a beautiful alliance between the kingship and the priesthood and the people. And then we hear of a very interesting terminology. Vayikach et sarei hameot vet hakariv vet haratzim vet kol ha'aretz vayaridu et hamelech mibeit Hashem vayavo derech shar haratzim beit hamelech vayashav al kisei hamlachim. The only other time that we hear about all of these ratzim going before the king, the ratzim, gan ala Kol Am Haaretz, is in fact Megillat Esther. Even though generally there are those that herald the coming of the king, here it's portrayed at the time of his coronation. So we hear that with the same quickness with which the letters go out, with all the ratzim, Ba'ir Shushan Navocha, with all the ones who are running out literally to destroy the Jewish people, Mordechai and Esther perhaps are alluding to the scene of Yoash, where ultimately Malchut rises and Kahuna, proper not just kingship, but proper spiritual leadership rises as well. Not only are Mordechai and Esther writing the story to show us how Haman and Achashverosh are subverting the proper leadership and leadership of justice, both from a perspective of Malchut, but also from a perspective of Kahuna. But then, if we want to draw one more allusion to Sefer Melakhim, of which, by the way, I'm sure everyone listening and opening up Sefer Melakhim can find many, many others as well. But we turn to the very end of Sefer Melakhim, where we hear about the exile of not just the kingship, but also the aristocracy. We hear about the king himself, Yehoiachin, and how he's exiled. And as we know, this exile that occurs in the year 597 BCE, Galut Yehoiachin, is the Galut that Mordechai and Esther draw the clearest allusion to. In introducing Mordechai, ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira, ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish ish Yemini, asher hagla miYerushalayim im hagula asher haglata im Yechonia melech Yehuda asher hagla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. These words are taken almost verbatim from Sefer Melakhim, Melakhim Bet Perach Daled, where we hear about how Nebuchadnezzar takes Yehoiachin, the king of Yehuda, and brings him to Bavel with the kelim, with the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash, in the 8th year, Bishnat Shmoneh L'Malcho, Vayotze Misham et kol otzrot Beit Hashem, ואוצרות בית המלך, ויקצץ את כל כלי הזהב אשר עשה שלמה מלך ישראל בהיכל השם, כאשר דיבר השם. The end of Sefer Melakhim brings us back to that magnificent melucha that we discussed in the previous podcast of the extravagance of not just the Melech Shlomo, but the Malchut Shlomo and the Beit HaMikdash. Vehegla et kol Yerushalayim, vet kol hasarim, vet kol giborei hachayil, Aseret alafim gole, v'chol hacharash v'hamasker, all the artisans, all of the cultured ones, the aristocracy, the bourgeois of society, lo nish'ar zulat, dalat am haaretz, only the proletariats remained in Yehuda. Vayagel et Yoyachin Bavela, ve'et em hamelech, ve'et neshei hamelech, ve'et sarisav, ve'et elei haaretz holich gola, miYerushalayim Bavela. And it's clear that Mordechai and Esther, in bringing us back to this exile, are telling us not only how this exile started, but here's perhaps the greatest inclusio allusion, showing us how the story of Megillat Esther ends. So if everyone can even open up to the very ends of Megillat Esther, a very strange ending, not only as we'll discuss in future podcasts of Divrei Shalom ve'emet, but the very last pasuk of Megillat Esther, we hear about Mordechai Yehudi, Mishneh LaMelech Achashverosh, we already discussed. Again, only the second in command, Vegadol LaYehudim, we also discussed, like Yehoshua ben Nun, Veratzui L'Rov Achav, Doresh Tov LaAmo, V'Dover Shalom L'Chol Zaro. Dover Shalom L'Chol Zaro, a very strange ending. And he speaks peace to all of his descendants. What could this possibly mean? And Mordechai and Esther know that you know Tanakh, and they know that you know Sefer Melakhim. So how do they end Megillat Esther if they begin Megillat Esther with the allusion to the end of Sefer Melakhim, to the Gola, to the exile of Yehoiachin? Then they end Megillat Esther by bringing us back to the beginning of Sefer Melakhim, by bringing us back, as we've already mentioned, to the roots of how Malchut is going to be restored. And that's exactly their message, which is that we want to show you how the exile, which summoned this terrible time of no Malchut, of lack of sovereignty and autonomy of the Jewish people outside of Eretz Yisrael, don't worry. Through this Malchut of Binyamin, literally descendants of Yosef, we're going to bring back Malchut Yehuda. We're going to help bring back and restore and revive Malchut in Eretz Yisrael, which I can't help but speak about also the contemporary relevance, namely of the wonders of the revival in Medinat Yisrael today, coming obviously from Olei HaGola, from all those coming from throughout the diasporan countries. So what is this allusion of V'dover Shalom L'chol Zaro? The only other time that we have the juxtaposition of Shalom and Zaro throughout Tanakh is the very beginning of Sefer Melakhim, the Malchut of Shlomo HaMelech, whom, as we're told, not only as David transfers the leadership to him, and not only through another allusion of Mered Adoniyahu, of someone who tries to usurp the throne. Shlomo is basically his older brother, which there really are allusions in Megillat Esther to the merit, to the rebellion of Adoniyahu as well. But what does Shlomo have to do? Not only quell the rebellion, but kill all the adversaries that existed from the time of David. And we hear in Perek Bet, Pasuk Lamed Gimel, Vishavud mehem berosh Yoav, uverosh Zaro la'olam, ule David, ule Zaro, ule Beito, ule Chis'o yesh shalom ad olam, Me'im Hashem, that only when Shlomo fully, literally executes all these adversaries, including Yoav and all of his descendants, only then can the descendants of David rise. And what is the term? Only then, when we quell all the rebels, only when justice is restored, only then will there be shalom lizaro. And that's exactly what Mordechai and Esther are teaching us through these allusions to Sefer Melakhim. It's not just about the restoration of a Beit HaMikdash. It's not just about appreciating how HaKadosh Baruch Hu controls the scene, and HaMelech is clearly Hashem, and not even the Melakhim of Yehuda or Yisrael that we see in Sefer Melakhim. But what they're teaching us is that in order to fully restore Malchut, you need the restoration of justice. And therefore, by focusing on the story of decrees sent by letters, just like Izebel and Achav, to annihilate an innocent person, Navot, for selfish reasons, economic reasons, that's exactly the broader culture in which they're living. They want to tell you we're living in a culture of Achav and Izebel. We're living in a notoriously unjust culture. But this time, it's not an individual's life at risk. It's the entire Jewish people. And the only way to restore Malchut, proper Malchut, is by restoring justice, is by making this wrong into a right, by literally killing one's adversaries, which Mordechai and Esther insist on doing. It's not enough to rid us of gezerot, of decrees of letters, but actually we have to make sure to annihilate those who represent the opposite of justice. And once we do, v'dover shalom l'chozaro, only then can you go back to the time period of Shlomo, who also knows how to rid the country of the adversaries, of those who represent the opposite, the antithesis of Malchut Yehuda. Mordechai and Esther, restore shalom l'chozaro, restore the Malchut that they hope will now perpetuate through the descendants, not just of Shlomo, but also of Shaul. Thank you for joining us again. I hope that this has shed light, both ideological messages, theological messages, and messages that we all must internalize today as well.
Thank you for joining us for Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin. This series is presented by Matan and World Mizrahi and powered by Walder Foundation. We hope today's conversation inspired you, sparked new ideas, and deepened your connection to the text and its meaning. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family who would appreciate these conversations. Your support helps us continue bringing thoughtful, meaningful Torah to the wider audience. We look forward to learning together again soon. See you in the next episode of Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin.